Welcome back to Sunday Seminary Online. I'm Brennan, and today we are continuing our study of the exilic prophets, or the prophets of the exile, especially Jeremiah and Ezekiel and what we call Second Isaiah. I'll get to what Second Isaiah is in a few weeks, but for now, we're going to start with the kind of background and context to the exile itself, and then we'll move into the book of Jeremiah first. Next week, we're going to focus on the historical context immediately surrounding the exile itself. So right around starting right around the year 600, and then explaining really the history of the next 50 years in some detail. That'll be the task for next time, to kind of set the stage for the book of Jeremiah. And then we'll jump into the text of Jeremiah, and we'll stay there for some time. But this session today has two goals. The first is to talk a little bit about the history of Israel, starting from its emergence and really up to the time of the exile. So really explaining like Israel's whole existence as a nation, and the northern kingdom of Israel until its fall, and the southern kingdom of Judah until its fall. So the exile is what we call the exile, is the destruction of Jerusalem and the surrounding kingdom of Judah, and the deportation of many of the people who lived there. So this is kind of a setting the stage week, but also we'll talk about the book of Amos, which is the first ever prophetic book to really be collected, at least we think. It's the first one that we know about. As I mentioned last time in the week 1 video, there were some texts that were collected by one of the kings of the kingdom of Assyria. So one Neo-Assyrian king, slightly after the time of Amos, collected some prophecies and then kind of edited them, like made them a new edition of them and so on. It took these little scraps of prophecies that had been given to him and really collected them into an actual collection of prophecies. You can call that a prophetic book, I guess, but it's very short compared to the book of Amos, and it doesn't have prose in it or like a superscription, which we'll get to in a little bit. It's lacking a lot of the features that are key for the prophetic books of the Bible. That really are trying to do something different with it. So that was a personal collection for one of the kings of Assyria. The book of Amos is really quite different, and so we'll get to the way, why was this thing written down. We'll talk about that some too. But so we'll talk a little bit about writing itself in ancient Israel and how that worked. So just to rehash a bit, just to catch us up to speed, prophets themselves are bearers of a message, of divine message, right? They're not divination by finding the kind of messages from the stars. They're messages given to the prophets. It's interesting that in Israel and in some of the areas surrounding, kind of nearby Israel, the prophets themselves were given much more respect than in other places in the ancient Near East, like Egypt and in Mesopotamia, where we know that they had prophets, but they didn't seem to care about them very much. They were seen as just delivery people of messages. In ancient Israel, they actually end up looking a lot more like those diviners. Like they have a higher stature, a higher status, at least some of them. So Elijah and Elisha seem, it's strange because they don't have a high status like in society. They live out in the middle of nowhere and seem to live on handouts from people that they interact with. But at the same time, they can talk to the king. So there's this really interesting difference. Israel is unique in that way, and some of the people surrounding it. So some of the other, like for example, the people who lived just to the east of Israel, there's record of, and there's actual plaster inscription of Balaam, one of the prophets who's mentioned in the Bible. Balaam is an actual prophet from an area right near Israel, and there's an inscription of Balaam. It's actually painted on plaster. There was an earthquake, it destroyed the city, but archaeologists painstakingly recovered this and so on, and it does seem like Balaam is getting messages from beyond, and seems to be in such high status that it's like, his name is included in the inscription. It was a monumental inscription of Balaam's vision. And his his prophecy that comes from it. So all to say, in the region right around Israel, prophets seem to be really important, and diviners seem to be of lesser status. They still existed, of course. The Bible, when the Bible tells you not to do something, it's because people are doing it. So in any event, I'll just say that the prophets, as I said last time, also had this kind of unique mission in ancient Israel. That is to stand up to kings. We'll see that here with Amos as well, and to stand up for the covenant, the covenant that God made with all of the people of Israel at the time of Moses. So the kind of covenant of Moses coming into conflict in some way with like the king's prerogatives in the covenant with David, especially in Judah, where the Davidite kings ruled. So that's kind of some of the background for that. One of the things to think about when you open up a prophetic book, they're confusing. They are strange. There's no other way to put it. One of the strange things about prophetic books in the Bible is that they're poetry. At least many of them are poetry or have lots of poetry in them. And ancient poetry is a little bit hard to read. I'll try to help us get some tools for that as we go through this course too. Poetry in any language is kind of unique, right? I mean, it's a way of using language that's not normal or prose, right? So when we read ancient Israelite poetry, we can see some interesting things about it. The first is parallelism. There are two lines that seem to kind of echo each other in some way. And really our job as readers of biblical poetry, ancient Hebrew poetry, is to try to figure out the relationship between those two lines. So just as an example, let me show you Psalm 19. So if you kind of read Psalm 19, when you read a biblical poem, and the prophets often speak in poems, the way that the rules of the game for ancient Hebrew poetry, when you see Psalm 19, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. That sounds like the person repeated themselves. That's a lot of what ancient poetry sounds like, and ancient Israelite poetry sounds that way too. So the heavens are telling the glory of God. So the stars in the sky are telling the glory of God. And the firmament, that's the word for the bowl that God turned upside down in Genesis 1 and formed this kind of air bubble that we live in, proclaims God's handiwork, the dome that's above us. So that sounds like that's an absolute repetition, but the game of biblical poetry is you want to see, like, it's never an exact restatement the second time that the lines occur. So we'd say these two lines are in parallel. That first line, the heavens are telling the glory of God, and it's in parallel to that next line, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Those aren't saying exactly the same thing. The heavens tell the glory of God, right? So you look up at the sky and you can see God's glory in some way. So, God's actions or the result of God's actions, the beauty of the world in some way does tell us about the glory of God, about how amazing God is, God's power, God's distance from us, but also God's kind of beauty, right? All of that is kind of told to us in some way through nature when we can see the beauty of the world. And then the parallel line, which sounds like an exact repetition, but it's not. And the firmament, that dome that God made the world with, proclaims God's handiwork. Well, the things that are in parallel there are firmament and heavens, the bowl that God put in the sky, right? Those are understood to be the same in ancient Israel, in their cosmology, their way of seeing the world. So those are in parallel. And then proclaims and tells, those are pretty similar, right? I tell you something, I proclaim something. There's a little bit of a difference, right? There's a communication aspect in the first. The second is kind of public, kind of enunciation or something, but very similar, communicating information. But then the third part, the glory of God and God's handiwork, are in parallel. And that's where the difference is, right? One famous biblical scholar has said, when you read biblical poetry, in lines like this, parallel lines, think of the first line saying A, whatever it says, and then the second line saying, what's more, B. Like, in trying to figure out what that connection is between them is the goal. So the heavens are telling the glory of God, the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. So the glory of God is not God's handiwork. Those are different things. God's glory is kind of what God is, right? The nature of God, the person of God. God's handiwork is what God makes. So what it's saying is that the firmament, the universe proclaims God's work, what God does. And then the second part of that is through that we can understand something of God's glory. And that's kind of the beauty of that poem, right? The beauty of Psalm 19 as a whole is that, the first part is all about how the universe is trying to speak to us through its beauty, its complexity, it's amazing, it's wonderful. But then the second half of it is about the law of God, about the Torah. So that is to say that like this, that God made the law, God made the Torah, God made God's instruction, the Bible, and God gave it to us so that we can know God, just like looking at the stars in the sky. Those are both ways that we can know something about God and interact with God. So that's a beautiful thing you can see in that poem, right? So if you think that way about the biblical prophets, and why would they speak in poetry? A lot of ancient prophets, not just in Israel, spoke in poetry, probably because there's one famous linguist, Roman Jakobson, who said that every type of speech has like a function. Like if I see you at a bus stop and I say, oh, we don't know each other, I just kind of run into you in the bus stop, and I say, it's raining. I might just be saying hi. That's a way of saying hi, or checking in with you, or just making small talk. Or I might be telling you, hey, open up your umbrella. Or I might be telling you, you might get sick, right? There's a lot of different things I might be doing if I say it's raining, if I come to a bus stop. One thing, though, is if you see a poem and it says, it is raining, that's doing something else. It's doing something different. Poems do something different than our normal everyday use of language. Roman Jakobson said the poetic function is when we use words to make art. The point of our speech is not just to communicate something, but it's to create art with words. And what Jakobson says is that there's this kind of transcendental power to that. That is that there's this amazing thing about language that when we use words, we're really talking about transcendence. We're talking about something kind of beyond us, bigger than us. Like if I say the word car and you get the picture in your head of a car, like that's kind of a magic trick almost that I just did, right? I mean, if I say sunset, all of a sudden you got a picture of a sunset in your brain. I just did that. I put something in your brain by moving my lips and creating an air bubble. And now through the miracle of technology, this is little electrons that are coming out and creating a speech that comes out of your computer, and all of a sudden now you got a sunset in your head. I mean, there's something almost miraculous about that. One literary theorist, Terry Eagleton, said that all language is a wager with transcendence. So all to say that when these prophets use poetry, you think about like Rumi, right? The kind of fairly, much more medieval, but a much more recent than the Bible, much more recent poet. But these poets that go into a frenzy or something, right, spin around, and then they would say something, right? Say these beautiful poems. You ever read the poems of Rumi? I mean, you should read them. Coleman Barks has some pretty beautiful translations in English. You read them, and that's someone who kind of went into a daze and spoke, and where'd it come from, right? That's the idea, is that this poetic inspiration comes from beyond. So when the prophets speak in poetry, it helps you remember it. It's memorable. It kind of makes you feel something oftentimes. So it's effective. All those things are important, but also it feels divine. I mean, there's something about poetry. Why do we sing hymns in church? Why do we sing poetry all the time in church? I mean, because there's something that it lifts our spirits up beyond. It connects us to God in some way. So in any event, all to say that that's why we read this poetry, but also it makes it hard, because poetry is always hard to read. So it makes the prophets kind of hard. It sometimes even makes us kind of like feel kind of distant from those prophets. But there's also something else, which is that the prophets would speak in ways that were borrowed from the culture around them. As I said in the last video, I mean, ancient Israel was part of the ancient society that they came from, that they lived in and around, right? I mean, they were Babylonian people like Abram and Sarah, or they were Egyptian people like Hophni and Phinehas. Those are Egyptian names. Or they were, Syrian people. They were from all over the place. They were Canaanite people, like Caleb. He's a Canaanite. He's not part of Abram's family. So these people, these ancient folks, they had ancient ways of speaking, and those ancient forms of speech are often connected to a particular kind of place in life. Like if I say once upon a time, that's connected to a particular kind of setting in life, right? So if I say once upon a time, you're imagining like a bedtime story or something like that, right? There's a parent reading to a child. There's going to be a moral at the end of it. Those are, it's like a genre, right? A type of speech is often connected to a type of literature that, there's like a whole world that it brings with it. Or if I say all rise for the honorable, right? Now we're in a court. We're in a courtroom. Well, the prophets often borrow their speech from different places in life. Like they borrow courtroom language. The prophets aren't in a courtroom. They're like standing in public yelling at people. But they say, all rise for the honorable Yahweh, God of the universe. And everyone's looking at them like, well, what's happening right now? But the prophets are borrowing that speech from different places in life. So if we know a little bit about prophetic, about the ancient world around the prophets, we'll be able to understand them and how they speak better too. And I'll show you some of these in Amos in a moment. Some of these different genres that they're borrowing from. Amos is a pretty good is pretty good at parody. Amos parodies a lot of different genres. And I think it's interesting that the prophets that come after Amos seem to kind of follow in that. I think Amos sets a lot of the trends for ancient prophets in ancient Israel. One other thing, though, is that the prophetic books themselves are organized in confusing ways. So just to recap, ancient poetry is confusing. All poetry is confusing. It's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to make you slow down and think, feel. So it's poetry. On top of that, these prophets are borrowing genres of speech from ancient forms of life that we aren't connected to anymore. So if someone says once upon a time, 1,000 years from now, they might not tell stories like that anymore, right? It would be hard to just know off the top of your head what ancient genres mean, or what, so I can help with that a little bit. But then the third kind of difficult thing is that the books themselves are organized in confusing ways. If you read the beginning of Amos, if you just kind of turn to the beginning of the book of Amos, and see, it starts like most of the prophetic books start, with a superscription. This is an editor who has written this. This is not written by Amos. So somebody has written this down later, and what they write here is the words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa. So they're giving you a little bit of biographical information about this person, and where they were from and what they did, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of King Uzziah of Judah, and in the days of King Jeroboam, son of Joash of Israel, southern kingdom and northern kingdom, 2 years before the earthquake. So there you got your superscription, which those occur at the beginnings of prophetic books in order to kind of fill you in on who's speaking, when were they speaking, who were they speaking to. Remember I said that prophets don't speak to like 1,000,000 years from now, or they don't just kind of speak in general. They speak to particular moments in time and place, and that's why these superscriptions tell us when they spoke, to try to get us to think like, what were they addressing? Like what were they talking about? Who were they speaking to? But then we jump in to the book, just if you look a little bit more at Amos, and you'll see there's some white space between the prose of the superscription, and then there's poetry that comes after that. Now the poetry begins verse 2, and he said. That's not Amos either. That's somebody, an editor, telling you what Amos said. So the words of Amos didn't write all these things down. The only biographical information we have about Amos after the superscription is in chapter 7, by the way, a little short story about Amos, and it's written in the third person. So Amos went and did this, Amos went and did that. So Amos is not the writer. It's possible that Amos knew how to write. It's also very possible he didn't. He spoke these things, and people heard them, and other people wrote them down. And then other people much later collected them into a book. So you can see this verse 2, and he said, and then the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. This is chapter 1, verse 2 of Amos. The pastures of the shepherds wither, and the top of Carmel dries up. So there's this kind of, God's going to roar. God lives in Jerusalem. Yahweh lives in Jerusalem. This is a good thing for Yahweh to say. And when Yahweh gets angry, Yahweh's going to roar, and you're going to hear it. And the world will respond. The earth is going to respond to Yahweh's kind of anger. And then there's a bunch of white space there. And then verse 3, thus says the Lord. And that's Amos doing the messenger formula. Amos is telling the people who've gathered somewhere, thus says the Lord. Just like if I was delivering a message in the ancient world from King David, I would say, thus says King David. Right? So you can see, thus says the Lord. And then at the end of that, verse 5, you can see, says the Lord. After exile to Kir, says the Lord. That's like kind of ending it, right? So that's one oracle, verses 3 to 5. An oracle is a message from God. Verses 3 to 5 give us one oracle. And then verse 6 begins, thus says the Lord. That's a new oracle, a different one. And then underneath that, at the very bottom, verse 8 says the Lord God, right? That's another oracle. And if you look, let's actually turn to chapter 5. If you turn to chapter 5, you'll see all these kind of little oracles split up from each other. Now, some of them I mean, all of these are split up that way in an English translation because the editors have figured that these are where the oracles are supposed to be split up. They have good reasons for this. You can argue with some of where these oracles begin and end, but just look at how short these oracles are. Look at chapter 5. Chapter 5 begins, "Hear this word that I take up over you in lamentation, O house of Israel." So this is Amos speaking, but telling people, hey, listen up. I'm going to sing you a sad song about you. And then verse 2, "Fallen no more to rise is made in Israel, forsaken on our land with no one to raise her up." And then white space, different oracle. Now, these may have been delivered all in a row. Some people argue that. It's probably more likely that these were spoken at different times and places. So you got white space there, and then verse 3 is an oracle, and then white space. And then verses 4 and 5 are an oracle. You can think like these were meant to be standalone little things. So when you read a prophetic book, you're not supposed to just read it all the way through as if it's like one long story. Look at where the oracles are divided up and take each one separately. So let's just look at verse 4 and 5 of chapter 5. That's one oracle. "For thus says the Lord to the house of Israel." There's the messenger formula, right? "To the house of Israel." That is, the northern kingdom that Amos is speaking to. "Seek me and live." So this is God speaking. It's Amos's voice speaking, but Amos says, this is my message from God. God says, "Seek me and live. But do not seek Bethel, and do not cross over into Gilgal or cross over into Beersheba." These are different places where people went to worship. Don't go to these worship houses. Seek me, but don't go to the houses of worship. That's not where I am, God says. "For Gilgal shall surely go into exile, and Bethel shall come to nothing." Those places of worship, there's something wrong with them. We'll get to what that is later, but just to say, that's the oracle, right? The oracle is seek me, but I'm not stuck in a building. That's what verses 4 and 5. And then verse 6, "Seek the Lord and live." That's a different oracle, but it's clearly connected to the one that comes before it. Do you see there's a connection there, but there's a separation too. Seek the Lord and live, verse 6, "Or God will break out against the house of Joseph like fire. It will devour Bethel with no one to quench it. Ah, you that turn justice to wormwood and bring righteousness to the ground." What's the wrong matter with these places of worship? They're turning justice into a poison, and they're taking righteousness and they're beating it into the ground. So don't go there if you want to try to find God. That's what the oracles, chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, that oracle says. So these are clearly connected in some way, right? Seek the Lord is kind of a refrain. You can see verse 14 of chapter 5, "Seek good and not evil that you may live." So what are we looking at here? Well, let me first say, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., but Martin Luther. I'll talk about him in chapter 5 of Amos in a little bit. But Martin Luther, the reformer, said this about the prophets. He was writing a commentary on the prophets, and he said, "They," that is the prophets, "have a strange way of talking, like people who, instead of proceeding in an orderly manner, ramble off from one thing to the next so that you can't make heads or tails of what they're getting at." I have sometimes felt like Martin Luther when reading the prophets. But think about it like this. So you dug this thing up. This is an ancient Israelite inscription, right? You dig this up. It's kind of a broken shard, right? You have to think of the historical context. When does this come from? You have to think about the language. What are they trying to say, maybe? You have to try to kind of reconstruct this ancient world that's missing, right? To be able to understand what they're talking about. Who is Amos talking to? What's going on in these cities, these place names, right? What were those, and why would Amos have been mad about them, and so on? You can get a lot of information from the book itself, but some things we can fill in from other biblical books or from other archaeological digs or other ancient historical genres, right? Other ancient literature from other peoples and so on. One of the things to think about is when we look at an ancient prophetic book, we have all these different oracles that have been arranged by other people, not by the prophet, him or herself. I say him or herself because there were ancient women prophets in ancient Israel. But the prophetic books that we have that have names on them are from men like Amos and Hosea and so on. But all to say that these when we look at one of these books, think of every one of those oracles as like a letter. Right, it's kind of like imagine that you are an archivist at a library, and you receive a box of papers from someone, a famous person. Let's say, here in Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. Right? Let's say I get some papers that someone has found in an attic, a box. That someone collected all of his desk that he worked at for 6 months. They collected all the papers and just kept putting them in a box and kept it there. And then you get them years later. And you might have some things from different times and places. You might have different types of literature, like some bills and some correspondence and a sermon. And let's say you want to publish these things. How do you arrange them? Well, you might arrange them by like topic, right, or time, right? These were arranged like this. Here's the early ones, and then here's the stuff that comes from like the near the end of his life, right? You might arrange it like that, or you might arrange it by like genre. All the sermons go first, and then next come the correspondence, and then lastly come like the administrative papers. Or you might publish them by topic, right? You have all the stuff that address justice here. You have all the stuff that addresses spiritual disciplines here, or whatever. So there's a kind of a principle of arrangement that you might be able to find and utilize. These are ancient Egyptian scribes here, but these ancient Israelite scribes would have acted very similar to ancient Egyptian scribes. And here they got their little scribal palettes. They're learning how to be good scribes over there. But just imagine that these ancient prophets, these ancient scribes, have a bunch of like some remembered kind of orally, snippets of prophecies, of oracles, and then they maybe have like some texts written down that someone remembered what a prophet said and wrote it down. Like Baruch is a scribe that follows around Jeremiah and writes down what Jeremiah says. So maybe you got some of that stuff. But it's not like Baruch brought a scroll and just like wrote everything that Jeremiah did all in order. And they would have written on like kind of scratch paper. They would have written on broken potsherds, ostraca they call them, right? Those little broken, and so they would have like written on stuff like that, or wax tablets they might have had, so they had kind of more disposable media that they would have written on for everyday things, and then they would have collected them into a book that they probably would have written on, perhaps clay tablets, but also then later a papyrus, and they would have had like kind of stacks of papyrus, and then last of all, they would have transferred those sometime around the year 300 BC or so. They started to write on like parchment, right, leather. They're making these giant leather scrolls, and so they had to kind of arrange the text like that. But so when you look at a prophetic book with all these different oracles, like just look at Amos chapter 5, what you're looking at is these people have painstakingly arranged the sayings of these prophets. Amos does have a logic to it. Chapters 1 and 2 of Amos are oracles about the places around Israel, and then lastly, Judah, and then the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. And it kind of tells a little story. It's like Amos is kind of prophesying against all these people that are around Israel, and then ends by saying, but you too. God isn't just mad at them, God's mad at you too. Then in chapters 3 through 6, there's oracles about the people of Israel. So, kind of God's anger at what's happened. I'll get to what exactly happened, what the problem was in a minute. But then chapters 7 through 9 are visions that Amos has. There's the visions of locust and a plumb line and so on. And there's one little bit there, chapter 7 verses 10 through 17, that are like a little biographical. It's kind of like a third-person narrative about Amos's interactions with the high priest and his treason, basically, for saying that God is going to kill the king. But you can see some of the kind of way. So in general, the book of Amos is collected with these kind of oracles at the front against Israel and Judah, and then these visions are the second half of the book. So it's kind of like somebody organized all this stuff based on, type of literature. But then also there's a chronological arrangement to some of this too. There's a geographical arrangement too. Amos 1 and 2 is all the kind of geography of God's judgment. And then chapters 7 through 9 kind of tell a kind of chronological story. God is angry at Israel, and Amos says, hey, give them some time. They'll get better. And then God says, okay. And then God says, I'm mad again. And then Amos says, give them some time. And says, okay. And then eventually it gets worse and worse and worse, and Israel never changes when Amos is trying to tell them what God's up to, and please change. Please stop hurting people. We'll get to the details of why God is mad in a moment. But then by chapter 9, it's kind of the end of the story. It's about the destruction of the northern kingdom. So Amos is really trying to explain the end of the kingdom, but it's arranged chronologically that way. These divisions are arranged chronologically that way. So that you can see some of these kind of organizing principles, like in chapter 5 of Amos. Remember, they seek this, seek that. Seeking was kind of like a catchphrase that was used to organize the material. Or in chapter 7, look at verse 9, very end. And in this vision, God says, I will rise against the house of Jeroboam with the sword. And then in verse 10, there's like this shift to prose. There's a little story that you get. Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent to King Jeroboam of Israel, saying, Amos has conspired against you. And then verse 11, for thus Amos has said, Jeroboam shall die by the sword. That's the same prophecy you heard in verse 9. It's just telling you what happened. What happened after Amos had this vision of Jeroboam dying by the sword? Well, the high priest went to the king and said, Amos says you're going to die. And then Amos gets his own life threatened. And ultimately, I think Amos was probably executed for saying this. So all to say that this is one of the ways that the editors have arranged this material in Amos, is by these kind of words that fit together. You can see some of this editorial work in the New Testament too, in the Gospels, like when Jesus tells a bunch of stories and they all involve like sheep or something, and they're kind of stitched together that way. Jesus probably didn't tell all those stories in a row like that. The people who were collecting the material about Jesus and editing them into the Gospels were trying to they had a bunch of teachings of Jesus, and like how do you stitch these together, right? Well, they found kind of motifs, and they kind of put the lost stuff in the various parables having to do with lost things in Luke. They kind of get put together, right? And this is an organizing editorial principle. So if you know that going into the prophets, that you're trying to look for little oracles, you're trying to think about historical context, you're trying to think about genre, what kind of literature am I reading? Are they making fun of something? Are they kind of sampling something? And then if you also think about kind of the larger editorial ideas, that'll really help us get some sense about what these poets are up to, right? So with that in mind, thinking about kind of the box of papers stuff, you're looking at this box of when you read Amos, you're looking at a big box of ancient papers that someone has arranged in a particular way. It's kind of our job to figure it out. And I'm grateful to those ancient scribes for gathering things together, even if I wish they would have given us a bit more context sometimes for their choices. But one other thing to think about is that this kind of historical context, right? Like what's going on at the time that they say these things. And we're going to focus on the Babylonian period for most of this semester. But we're going to start this week in the Assyrian period. I'm actually today going to go all the way back to kind of the origin of Israel and tell a short little story. But it really helps to think like when is this happening, and what is going around, what's going on at that time that this thing is happening. So I'll give a little bit of that historical context for Amos as well. Here's a little timeline of these prophetic books, just so you can get a little sense of these are all of the prophetic books in the Bible. And so here we have the three different periods. The Neo-Assyrian period. I know this is a little bit small writing, sorry, but just to fit them all in, there's a bunch of books in the Bible. But so these are all the prophetic books. So you can see there's the Neo-Assyrian period from 800 to 700 BC. So the 8th century BC is what we call that. But there's Amos, Hosea, Micah, and then Isaiah chapters 1 through 39 reflect that period. So if you want to know about the book of Amos or the book of Hosea, knowing a little bit about that century is really going to help. But also that what's cool is that if you know Amos's context, then you can just transport a lot of that over to Hosea, because they spoke to roughly the same people at roughly the same time. So knowing what prophetic books go to get, who is speaking at roughly the same time can really help. And if you know about one, you can kind of figure out, well, who else do I know then? Who else can I read with that same background knowledge? So what we're going to talk about this semester is the Babylonian period, right? So we have some minor prophets, that is Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Obadiah. And those are Zephaniah is kind of the earliest of those. Nahum is about the fall really of Assyria and celebrating the fall of Assyria. Habakkuk is basically, think of someone saying, "Oh no, the Babylonians are not any better, and in fact they're coming for us." And then Obadiah is also kind of angry about things that have happened in the Babylonian period and in the exile. So they kind of are in a roughly historical order there. And then Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah 40 through 55 are the three major prophets from this period. Jeremiah starting the earliest in terms of like Jeremiah's plot, kind of starts the earliest, and then Ezekiel picks up right kind of in the middle of the exilic. I'll explain the details of Ezekiel later, but just to say, Ezekiel is picking up the story kind of in the middle of Jeremiah when the exile has just begun. And then Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 is spoken to people who are at the cusp of returning. So think of it as like Jeremiah first, then Ezekiel, then Isaiah 40 through 55. And then the Persian period, well, I won't talk about that this time, but that's the return, right? Once they come back to the land, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Isaiah 56 through 66 refers to and speaks to the people who have come back to the land of Judah and are trying to rebuild Jerusalem. And then Joel and Jonah are kind of like wild cards. No one knows exactly when these were written. Joel especially is, I think it was written in the Persian period, but it's got very few references to history and context. And it's a strange book. I mean, it's really cool in many ways, but it's very strange too. And then Jonah is set in the Assyrian period, right? So it's like set back in, when Nineveh is a city that people would go to, so before the time of Babylonian dominance in Mesopotamia. But it's, I think it's written during the Persian period. It's the language that's used, but also some of the themes that it has seem to set itself. It doesn't sound anything like Amos and Hosea and Micah. It's not talking to the same people at the same time, I don't think. So I think it's a story that's kind of set earlier, but it's really speaking to people at a different time and place. That is the Persian period. So this is my best guess about the prophetic books in the Old Testament. So what I'm going to do now is give you a little background to the emergence of Israel, kind of some historical stuff. And the reason is I think this helps us to understand a lot about why why Amos is so mad, but then why Jeremiah is so mad. People, look at the prophets and they're like, why are the prophets so mad? They're just mad all the time. They even get kind of boring because they're so mad all the time, right? But if we know something about the history of ancient Israel, it really helps us to get a handle on what's going on. So in any event, here, without further ado, I'm going to talk about some changes that happened between the 12th century BC and the 8th century BC. The 12th century BC is when Israel emerges as a people. This is the time of the Bronze Age collapse. All the major kingdoms of the world, including Egypt and the Hittite Empire, which is in like what's now modern day Turkey, the Mesopotamian kingdoms, they all basically collapse at the same time because of climactic change. There was dramatic climactic change which broke down. There were basically lots of starvation. There was a shortage of food and of water. There's a drought, and food dried up. And the kingdoms that depended upon lots of food resources, like, think of an ancient city, right? People aren't growing all their own food, so they need the food, and then the food's not showing up, so the cities empty out. Everyone's, there's mass starvation, but then also there's kind of a breakdown of trade, and these centers of power dissolve because they can't support themselves. So there's this kind of some people call it the Dark Age, right? This kind of a centuries-long power vacuum in the ancient world, which actually gives Israel a chance to emerge and become a nation. The area around Canaan, before Israel emerges, was run by Egypt. It was like little city-states, and we'll talk about this more. But after the collapse, there's like little nations that form, and those little nations would have been just dominated by Egypt, but Egypt is in kind of retreat at the time. So it gives this kind of power vacuum that allows these little local states to form, and Israel is one of them. So we'll talk about that now. Okay, so here's a little map of late Bronze Age Canaan. So Bronze Age, I don't need to tell you when it starts and so on, but late Bronze Age is right around the year 1300 BC, but like around 1200 BC. And the Bronze Age was, there were technological marvels of the Bronze Age, like the Egyptian pyramids were all built during the Bronze Age. The big pyramids were not built. They had all been around for a long time before Israel showed up. And when Israel showed up as a people, Egypt was not building big pyramids anymore, and they never would again, precisely because they had declined in their power, just like all the other regional kingdoms. All the regional empires had declined in power. So the Bronze Age was the millennia-long period of time, but late Bronze Age, and by the way, we'd use Bronze Age or Iron Age. It refers to the kinds of metals that people used when they made tools. But one way to think about it is, at the end of the Bronze Age, you had city-states in Canaan that were all subservient to Egypt. So here you see a little map, cities that may sound familiar to you, like Shechem here, or Megiddo, or Hatzor. These are all in the Bible. These all become later, or Jerusalem down here, by the way, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Hebron, Lachish. These are all Canaanite cities. Sorry, I'm going to go back here. These are all Canaanite cities that later become Israelite cities. So these were city-states, and the way that Canaan ran in the late Bronze Age, you can see the little kind of territories here. They were all subservient to Egypt. They all had to give Egypt some tax. but they were all run by like a city that had a major like power structure in it, an actual fortification, and there was a king that lived there, and there was a big temple, and there were high priests there, and so on. Here you can see this is Hatzor, which is kind of in the north of Israel, and it was a Canaanite city in the Bronze Age. There's no Israel. Israel didn't exist yet. The Semitic slaves in Egypt, like think like post Joseph, right? But this is before Moses. But so you got these fortifications here in Hatzor, and this what's underneath like the kind of building that roof obviously isn't that's a modern thing that archaeologists built to try to protect it. But this Canaanite city had a major I'm going to move myself over to the side here, had a major palace in it, just like most of these cities did. So these Canaanite cities had huge palaces. I mean, think about how much food it takes to kind of like support one of these things, right? You got these kind of pillared courts and then like the kind of ceremonial court. So there's kings, right? There's little local kings that live in these palaces, and these kings have temples that are right next to it. And the way that these things run is that there's basically plantations in the area around here, right? Around each one of these cities. The city-state exists to support the city, to support the king, to support the temple. The way that the religion of the time and goes is that you have to support the gods of the temple, and they have needs. You have to actually feed them. So there's a statue in the temple, which is not the god's body, but the god can kind of inhabit it in a special way. And you can offer food to the gods through these places, through these temples, and you can burn incense for them and pour them drink offerings and so on. You want to give the gods a nice life. Why do you want to give the gods a nice life? Because the gods made you people in order to be their slaves, because they didn't want to work. They want you to work. So you work, you farm, you bring your stuff to the temple and to the king to protect you, or because the king is kind of the intermediary between earth and heaven. So the king is one who kind of intercedes with the gods for you. So you have to support them. So you bring your stuff, a big share of your proceeds of your farm, if you're a peasant, and you bring them and give them to the temple, right? So and to the king. So this is kind of the way the world works, right? This is the economy of ancient and society and religion all tied together. They're all the same thing of Bronze Age Canaan. Now, remember, Israel doesn't exist yet. Think about Abram and Sarah kind of running around in this situation, right? You're going to read about these towns or cities that they're staying at, and they have to kind of talk to kings sometimes, these little local kings. This is the situation. So you can see all these different palaces that are found in Shechem, Megiddo, Beth Shan, Tel El-Farah. I'm showing you this because the big cities with the big walls and the big palaces that are supported by all of the different farmers, the peasants, right, who are basically at starvation, on the edge of starvation all the time. I'm showing you this because something big changes when Israel emerges. So, right about the year 1200 BC, there was this major event, the late Bronze Age collapse, in which, as I said earlier, there were some climactic shifts and changes, and trade relations broke down. All of the major empires went through very difficult times in terms of food and droughts and so on, and they tended to collapse in terms of their military power. So Egypt, which had controlled Canaan for many years, for many centuries, retreated, and there was a power vacuum in the area. At this time, there were disruptions among the major cities, like major cities everywhere across the ancient Near East. Many of these city-states went into decline. Some of them managed to hang on for quite some time. King David, around the year 1000 BC, ends up conquering Jerusalem, which held on as a city-state. It was a Canaanite city-state that was lived in by people who called themselves the Jebusites. You can read about this in the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel, chapter 6, when David, actually 5 is when David conquers Jerusalem, and 6, David moves the ark into Jerusalem. But it had existed that whole time, from the emergence of Israel until basically King David conquers it. It had existed as a Canaanite city-state surrounded by the Israelites. So where did the Israelites come from? Well, there's a lot of archaeological, historical debate about that and so on, but one thing we do know is right about the year 1200 BC, at the same time that all the major city-states are declining all throughout Canaan, Egypt falls apart. And the exodus of Semitic slaves might be kind of a part of this late Bronze Age collapse. They move up into Canaan, and also these Canaanite city-states themselves are falling apart and kind of disintegrating. There's a lot of archaeological evidence for that as well. This map over here that you can see, this is the land of Israel, Canaan, etc. And all those dots are these small. There's about 250 now that have been discovered. There are about 250 small settlements that all emerge at roughly the same time, right about the year 1200 BC, during the time of this Bronze Age collapse and the shift to the early Iron Age. They're mostly in the highland areas. They're in areas that were not lived in before. So the valleys are where you want to farm in the ancient Near East. I mean, everywhere, so it's hard to farm on mountaintops and in mountains. You have to, find areas that are possible to farm there, but also you have to contour the land and so on, which is really hard to do, especially without a lot of ancient tools. But in these sites, these 250 sites that emerge, they were small, and they all had this kind of a similar shape to them. This is Isbet Sarta, which is, you can see Isbet Sarta on this map. If you see Shechem kind of in the middle, a little bit to the south and to the west of that is Isbet Sarta. That little new settlement in which no one had lived in that area previously, it's a new settlement. At the same time that these other city-states in the area are falling apart and are unable to project their power. We can imagine peasants were leaving those places and trying to found their own settlements. We can imagine other people were migrating from other areas and so on. So this was a time of great turmoil in the area. So the settlements, all 250 of them, tend to look like this. This is Betsarta settlement. This is from the air. This is like a little architect's map from the air. The center there, that's just open space. It's kind of protected in a way by the buildings themselves. Those squares are the buildings. That's where people lived. They're connected together. They're in kind of a circular settlement. There's no walls really, but the outside walls of the houses kind of form a little bit of protection there. And in the center, that's where like animals would have been held basically for the community. But also those little circles, those are grain pits. And you can see that the houses are roughly the same size. They don't find a whole lot of like luxury goods in these places. When they do find luxury goods, they tend to be pretty evenly distributed. So there's not like a king of these things, right? These are a pretty kind of a flat hierarchy, right? I mean, there's the people who live there they see themselves as kind of like one big family in a way, or a clan. So this is Isbet Sarta here, right about the year 1200 BC, the beginning of the Iron Age. What's emerging out of the late Bronze Age collapse. These little settlements would have been, self-sustaining. They would have been farmers. They would have also had some livestock. They would have had diversified kind of crops. Everyone would have done, all of the work of the area together. There's no king. There's no temple. Just everyone is doing the same things together. And we can see here, let me move myself here. We can actually see something happen to these settlements. This is just Isbet Sarta. It goes from right to left, this kind of map through time. This is the same site in three different, same location in three different kind of archaeological layers, right? Strata. I mean, archaeology is kind of like a layer cake. If you dig down, you get to older stuff, right? Things pile up over time. Detritus and kind of broken things, pile up over time, but also dust and so on. So when you dig down in ancient Israel, you dig into the past. And so there are these three layers that archaeologists found for Isbet Sarta, and this is true for other sites as well. There's this early Iron Age formation. These are what we imagine the Israelites would have been. They tend to have pottery that's kind of like a unimpressive. It's just kind of handmade pottery without a lot of decoration on it. Decoration would have been pretty easy to do, so it seems like a choice they're making to be kind of austere, and they are intentionally not organizing themselves like the city-state model. That is to say, there's no king, there's no temple, etc. They seem to kind of live together, right? This seems to line up with the kind of ideas we see in Moses' law. The idea of shared land, that everyone has access to land in the community. Everyone's got access to equal land in the community, and that you can kind of lose it, but then the next generation gets it back. There's this kind of basic idea that everyone is the same. You read Moses' law, and it mentions kings only once in Deuteronomy, but it says that the king's not supposed to get anything more than anything else, anyone else. The king's not supposed to build up stuff or acquire possessions, or everyone is supposed to live a pretty equal life. This is what we actually see in the archaeology of these new settlements that emerged sometime around the year 1200 BC. But there's a major shift over time. And as I said earlier, this is, I think, part of the theology of ancient Israel is like in the archaeology, like in the architecture of these places, right? But something changes. Right around the year 1000, David becomes king. The monarchy rises. And when the monarchy rises, things change. Things change architecturally. You have to have palaces. You have to feed those palaces, right? With grain that's kind of hoarded from the countryside. Well, how do you do that? You have to have local people who gather a lot of the grain and then send it off to the king. And of course, those people now become little lords. So there's an emergence that changes once you get the monarchy into something that looks a little bit more like the Canaanite city-state. So at that same exact site is Betsarta. We have this kind of like clan-like community here in the year 1200 BC. That is knocked down. And in 900 BC, we have a giant house with all these grain pits. You see all these grain pits? They're not like communal anymore. That's like one house like runs this area. And then there's some other structures outside of that. 100 years later, we have one giant house that's been added onto and all these grain pits, but no other standing structures. Now, where were all those farmers to farm all that stuff? What happened to them? Well, they must have lived in houses that did not last because they weren't made of stone. That is to say, we moved from people all living in roughly similar circumstances and working together, farming together. We kind of changed into having a giant factory farm, as it were, and a lord of the manor that lives there, and everyone else who farms in that space lives in a hovel. This is a major transformation to ancient Israel's economy. They are producing way more in 800 BC than they were in 1200 BC. The wealth of the community has gone way up. They now have an army that can conquer and take vassal territory from other kingdoms that surround them, like Moab and Edom, and force them to give tribute and things. That is to say, the standard of living generally goes up a lot, but it's very few people who actually have that concentration of wealth. And we can see that in the community by 800 BC. So from 1200 BC, the beginning of Israel, its emergence as a people with a new and different ideology, new and different theology, right? New and different way of living together. We can see this major transition that happens by the year 800 where things have changed. And if you were a prophet of Yahweh, looking at Yahweh's law, you would look at it in 800 BC and you say, we lost something. We changed. We no longer respect the idea of a nachala, or an inheritance, the land that belongs to each family in perpetuity, that gets returned to them every generation and so on. They're clearly not living like that in 800 BC. But it's possible that they were living like that in 1200 BC. So that is to say that there's something that you're giving up, not just in terms of like standard of living. You're giving something up in terms of your theology, in terms of your relationship to God and each other. And this ethical, theological, economic, social, political transformation, which they're all the same thing in the ancient world, this was seen as trying to be like the nations around them, giving up on Yahweh and what made Yahweh distinctive, the distinctive claims of Yahweh's law. Instead, living like the peoples around you, and that's idolatry. You're worshiping Baal. So the idea, like, this is connected with the idea of like you're abandoning Yahweh and worshiping Baal if you live like Baal wants you to live. In the ancient world, worshiping didn't just mean praying to some, like a god or singing some songs, something like that, showing up to a particular temple. It didn't primarily mean that. It meant conforming your whole life to try to serve that god by giving them grain, right? Like that was the idea. So, if there was it's according to the biblical texts, the way that they see this as a huge transformation to like trying to worship Baal. So we saw that in the Elijah and Elisha stories, and we'll see that also, the idea of idolatry being connected to a transformation of way of life, of economy, etc. We'll see that in Jeremiah as well, and an abandoning of Yahweh's law. Jeremiah's famous temple sermon in Jeremiah 7 is based on this basic idea. So here's another just example in the south in Judah. This is Beersheba, right around the year 1200 BC, little tiny settlement, everyone living roughly the same size. By the year 800, well into the monarchy by the time of Amos, this is what Beersheba looks like. It's a walled city. There are stables, royal stables, and so on. It's been transformed into a place where a commoner wouldn't live. The commoners would live outside this space. This space would be reserved for the elite, the soldiers. the bureaucrats, administrators, and so on who run the nearby areas, and the priestly elite too, who run the temple. There would have been, and there was, a kind of a worship complex at Beersheba. I know the Bible says that there was only a temple in Jerusalem, but we actually have the altar from Beersheba. So they had worship structures there, and a local priest who were designated to take care of the people in that place, which we would expect that they would have. But all to say that this a major transformation, we can see technological transformations. Here's like the invention of a wine press, a grape press, that was built to try to like increase productivity. So what happens here is that the king begins to tax people in certain kinds of goods. So the king would tell people in good grape growing areas, you need to grow grapes and I'll tax you in wine. So now you need to focus on wine production to pay your annual tax. And that means you're producing tons of wine now, but you're not producing wool for clothing, and you're not producing grain, to eat, and you're not producing olive oil anymore. You're focusing on the thing that you have to specialize. This increases production, which the kings like. It increases the king's ability to get goods. It also means that people aren't self-sufficient anymore. It means that they have to now trade. They have to enter into a merchant economy and try to trade for different goods. It puts them in a disadvantage because they've never had to do that before. They might trade little things here and there with their neighbors, but they weren't like involved in people made what they consumed. But now they have to produce a lot of things and then try to trade, which puts them at the mercy of traveling merchants and things like this. So, and these people are excoriated in the prophets. Why? Because they often took advantage of the local people that they saw as rubes. This is flying in the face of the Mosaic admonitions to take care of your neighbors, to not take advantage of them, to protect especially the weak, instead of trying to take their last garment from them, and so on. If you read Deuteronomy and you read the laws in Exodus with that in mind, tons of things light up because it's written clearly about that. And also the prophets light up if you have these things in mind too. The kings would also force people to have standardized jars. You have to buy these jars from the king in order to pay the king taxes. So now you have this like extra, tax on top of everything else. This is the seal of Judah. This is Hezekiah's seal right here. That says Yahweh on top for Hezekiah. But it's so this is for the king. It says down on the bottom, for the king. These are the Lamelech jars. Lamelech is for the king in Hebrew. So these had stamps on them, official stamps, and so it was like you had to fill these things up and then give them back to the king, and then you got to live on what was left. This made people live precarious lives because let's say you had a bad year, you were like the grain guy. Like the king told you, you live in a good grain area, we're going to increase production by telling you have to pay all your tax in grain. It's going to force you to specialize in grain. Then you pay all your taxes in grain, and you try to trade what's left in order to survive. Now, what happens if there's a bad year? If there's no rain that year, you now are in debt for your taxes. You still got to pay them, but then on top of that, now you don't have the grain to plant for next year's. See, if you had a diversified local economy, then you would rely on your other crops that year, the ones that didn't fail. But instead, now you have to plant. You have to borrow, on credit or debt. You have to go into debt to borrow seed to plant for next year because all your crops are dead. So this is a spiral. So now you're in debt. You have to pay your taxes with using borrowed money, and then you have to borrow money to get the investment to plant the seeds for next year. All of that puts you in the hole. And this actually drove people into debt slavery. We start to see records of debt slavery in Israel at this time. Now imagine going from a local community where you knew everybody and everybody was kind of working together to a local community where there were certain people who had kind of gotten lucky in some ways and had figured out the tricks of the trade and had managed to make everyone else around them indebted servants. Remember that Isbet Sarta map, the change over time? That's how those people got pushed out and living in hovels while other people began to build castles for themselves. This is a giant wine pit for fermenting wine. Just to say, they would create lots more of one thing that they would need, but they would only create that one thing. So you start to see these kind of industrial size food production units, these technologies that begin to be built all around Israel in the beginning of what we think of as a monarchical period. So around the 8th century. So here's, by the way, the northern kingdom of Israel. This is Samaria. So this is ancient Samaria. Omri, king of Israel, founds Samaria as a place that he can like kind of be protected in a way, because he founds the city. He can build it the way he wants to protect himself, so he won't get assassinated, which had happened to a lot of northern kings up to that point. This is the foundations of probably Omri's palace in Samaria. So these giant palaces begin to be built because you got kings; they're going to live in giant palaces, right? So this is the beginning of this kind of a period of luxury. We start to see ivory goods. These are ivory goods that were in Samaria that were captured when Samaria was destroyed by the Assyrians and taken to Assyria, and they were discovered by modern archaeologists in Nineveh. So, it's a pretty crazy thing that these lions and these ivory products. Imagine how much grain you'd have to produce to like take grain and sell it for like a piece of ivory that would have been made into like a luxury object. So we start to see these preciosities or luxury objects that start to emerge at the time of the kingship. So like in the 8th century, and this is Israel's becoming more wealthy, but the average person is having to like pay for these ivories and the artistic practice of making them, which would have been incredibly expensive with like their grain. So you have to push more and more people into desperate levels of poverty and into debt slavery in order to sustain the living like this for the aristocratic class, which had just emerged. These are also ivory panels. These were all found in Samaria, or found in Nineveh, but they were from Samaria. You had things like here's Horus. Egypt was the major artistic engine in the area, and Phoenicia would import art from Egypt, the great traders, the Phoenicians to the north of Israel, and people in Phoenicia began to kind of mimic Egyptian art styles and things like this. So this is a Sumerian. An ivory from Samaria that depicts Horus. So because the Phoenicians would kind of copy Egyptian art styles, you get all this kind of Egyptian-looking art in the area. So these are luxury items that are tied into the livelihood of other peoples who worshipped other gods, and like those things are all connected. Here's an ivory bed, by the way. Amos talks about ivory beds in chapter 6. He says, alas for you, right? He says, alas for those who lie on beds of ivory and lounge on their couches. Amos gets really mad because the kind of luxury, he's not mad at nice things. Amos doesn't hate nice things. He doesn't hate nice food and wine and so on. He thinks those things are great, I'm sure. What he hates is that there are certain people who have taken advantage of their neighbors in order to acquire excess goods like this, and then they have lavish parties with them while their neighbors are suffering nearby. That's what Amos is really mad about. There was something called the Marzeak feast that peoples around Israel would celebrate. There were a lot of names for this thing. This over here is a bowl from Iran, from the ancient king of Persia, who has his name inscribed on it, and as a giant bowl for drinking wine. This is an Egyptian version of this kind of celebration. You can see in the top there's a young woman getting sick. People would drink to excess and eat to excess and then get sick in public in order to show how rich and wealthy and powerful they were. That is, I can have so much that I can get sick in public, but the peasants would be like watching them, right? This is the idea is you'd see your livelihood being consumed and then expelled because someone had eaten it to excess, while you might be selling your child into debt slavery because you don't have enough grain to plant next year's field. So this kind of social structure was not uncommon in the ancient world. But according to Deuteronomy and Exodus, this is not how ancient Israel was supposed to survive. They weren't supposed to copy these ways of the nations around them, which were tied to religious festivals. And so it's idolatry, right? Worshipping another god. But it's really like living an entirely different way of life. In ancient Israel, you start to find these kind of preciosities, these gold, silver, bronze items and so on. There's some copper mines where people would end up having to live pretty terrible lives basically south of the Dead Sea, that Israel would have to fight wars over sometimes to try to keep hold of. So all to say that there was a lot of like externalities, to use an economic term, right? There's a lot of pain and suffering that was spread around to the people in order to get the things that certain people wanted. There were a lot of consequences, human consequences, for all of this behavior. And as I said, this transition to a nascent market economy, when I say market economy, like buying and selling things, people didn't really buy and sell much in the earliest of Israel, right? I mean, they farmed locally, and they didn't have money. They didn't even use money. Coins didn't exist until the Persian period. The Persians invent them. So the entire time that we're going to have this study, there weren't coins. People didn't use them. What people might use gold or silver. So the stuff in the Old Testament that says money, the word is actually silver in Hebrew, and it wasn't like stamped or anything like that. It was just a hunk of silver. So farmers didn't want silver. They couldn't use it. They couldn't sell it. Your farmer neighbor doesn't want a shiny metal. They want seeds. They want tools. They want, and you can't use like gold or silver to like build nice tools very easily. You want bronze for that, right? Or iron is even better. But so now because of the way that the kings had created the system of taxation, now the people had to specialize in certain goods and buy and sell everything else. And so they had to enter into a sort of a market economy. They had to buy and sell things to survive. And so these merchants would come by and take advantage of them. So it's a tricky thing. The weights that you see over here, these are from the Louvre. And these were easy to kind of manipulate, right? To make the weights heavier or lighter in order to make the merchant come out ahead, right? The merchant would cheat people with these things. And you can see in the book of Amos, but also in the book of Jeremiah and elsewhere, that the prophets are very upset with how people take advantage of each other with these kinds of things. Check out Amos chapter 8, verse 4. He says, "Hear this, you that trample on the needy, and bring to ruin the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath, so that we may offer wheat for sale?" The Sabbath and the new moon were religious festivals. So it's like they're sitting in their religious festival. I just can't wait for this thing to be over so that I can go and cheat some people out of some money, right? We will make the ephah small and the shekel great. Those are weights. They're going to in containers of size. An ephah is like a liter or something. They're going to, make the liter small and the shekel great, the weight great. So in other words, they're going to cheat people out of their stuff and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and selling the sweepings of wheat. The prophets are upset about these kinds of practices precisely because the law of Moses says that you're supposed to protect the poor and protect the needy, and that's one of the things that's distinctive about Yahweh in the ancient world. Baal doesn't necessarily care about the poor and the needy very much, but Yahweh does. This is the deal. So if you start to transform your way of life, even if you say you're worshiping Yahweh, you're not. And that's why the prophets get so mad about worship. They don't hate worship. And so Amos says, take away your songs from me. Take away your smells. I don't want your sacrifices. They're not saying sacrifices are bad. What they're saying is when you offer these sacrifices in order to cover up your terrible lifestyle of hurting other people, or if you're offering to try to kind of get out of jail free, right? You're trying to kind of buy your way out of behaving poorly, or if you're offering them to Yahweh, but really your whole life means that you're offering them to Baal, then God doesn't want them. God, in fact, thinks that you're doing harm by offering those kinds of sacrifices and gifts to God. That kind of worship is worse than nothing, is what the prophets say. So this is kind of just giving some background to kind of these prophetic messages. So if I'm going to look at this kind of 8th century context, look at the book of Amos and think, okay, Amos is really mad at Israel because Israel has transformed in these ways. The best place to go for this is chapter 2, verse 6, when Amos says that God is really mad at Israel because, verse 6, they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. Remember, the buying and selling people, debt slavery. Because you've pushed these people into debt slavery. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. Anyway, I've got to move on because of time, but there's plenty of, the whole book is full of these claims that the people have abandoned God. They say they love God, they say they worship God, but they've abandoned God because of the way that they have transformed their entire society. This is why, if you remember back when I was talking about chapter 5, seek me and live, but don't seek Bethel, don't seek Gilgal. Don't go to the worship sites. Seek me. And what does seeking me mean? Verse 14 from chapter 5, seek good and not evil, so that you may live, so that the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you just as you've said. You say God's with us? Really? You have to actually seek good and not evil. Establish justice in the gate, and so on. Okay, so enough of that. So this century, everyone who heard Amos saying these things would have thought that he was crazy, because Amos says these things at the moment that ancient Israel is at its peak, at its pinnacle. It's stronger than it's ever been before, and no one sees any serious problems on the horizon. Let's say it's about 745 or something like this BC that Amos says all this stuff. I mean, they look richer, right? He's saying this in a city. He's saying this in the city of Bethel, which was a northern Israelite royal center, royal chapel, and so on. And the people that he's saying this to are the ones that are living in the city. Amos isn't getting mad at poor farmers. In fact, Amos says when the rich of the land die, the poor farmers are the ones who are going to be left and mourn them. Amos is getting mad at the people in the cities who are abusing the poor and the weak. And Amos is saying, if you don't change your ways, God is going to unbuild this, just like God unbuilt Pharaoh, unbuilt Egypt, right? The Exodus. Amos talks about the Exodus all the time. This is the fundamental metaphor for the prophets, is the Exodus. What happened in the Exodus is that God loved the people who had been abused and forced into slavery, and God set them free, but by first offering clemency and liberation to all people, right? The Egyptians' liberation from their moral depravity of oppressing the people of Israel, or the Hebrews, right? So like there's kind of liberation offered to everyone, including Pharaoh, who thinks that he's on top, but really he's oppressed by his own system. So Moses says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, no, I won't. All right. Pharaoh has many, many chances to change his ways when he's heard the message. And finally, God says, okay, I'm not going to let these poor people continue to suffer just because Pharaoh won't change his mind. And that's when God gets involved. God gets involved by wiping out Pharaoh, and then creating a space for Israel to emerge as a people. So this is the story of Amos, and the other prophets follow, I think, from Amos. In a way, Amos says, you've turned into Pharaoh, and we know what God does, and you have lots of chances to change. In chapters 7 through 9, these visions of Amos, there are chance after chance after chance that the people are given to change. And after a time, God says, I'm going to knock this building down, because it's doing terrible things to people that I love. So that's the story of Amos. And Amos would have seemed like a nut job when he was saying this stuff, because Israel was so powerful. But within a couple of decades, the troubles had emerged, and Israel falls in 722. So let's say that at about 745, Amos prophesies, by 722, within just a couple of decades, Israel doesn't exist anymore. They went from their highest peak to not being non-existent, in a short amount of time. So the book of Amos probably was collected after the time that Amos prophesied. Amos probably was executed. At least I think he was. I mean, in chapter 7, the one thing we hear about Amos is that the king says, you're committing treason by saying that I'm going to die. And Amos says, I'm going to keep saying it, basically. So that doesn't seem like it ends well for him. But nonetheless, Amos would have seemed like this kind of, loser who got executed by the king, but then very soon afterwards, there was an earthquake. So it says in the superscription that Amos prophesied 2 years before the earthquake. It's chapter 1, verse 1. Amos prophesied 2 years before an earthquake. So it seems like there was this major earthquake a couple years after he prophesied. And then people said, didn't that guy say that Yahweh was going to roar from Zion and like the earth was going to shake? That's chapter 1, verse 2. What else did that guy say? And they collected together these things. And, in chapter 7, the priest, the high priest, tells the king what Amos had said, because people had spied on Amos, because they thought that he was, fomenting disturbances in the land. So they wrote down what he said. I mean, I'm guessing a lot of the book of Amos was compiled by people who were spying on him. And some of it was probably compiled by people who thought he was telling the truth and he was important, and and so on. But that stuff gets compiled together to create the book of Amos after the fact. probably after the fall of the north. Maybe near the fall, but probably at the fall of the Northern Kingdom. So there's a lot of stuff to talk about. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but just to say what happens, why does it fall kind of geopolitically? Because Assyria emerges again. Remember 1200 was that kind of the collapse, the Bronze Age collapse? Well, it's really only in the 8th century that Assyria gets its stuff together and begins to really strongly encroach into the Levant, the Mediterranean coastland where Israel is. So Tiglath-Pileser III is the king who manages to organize the Assyrian war machine strongly enough that he can push into that area. Why do they want to conquer Israel? Because that area around Syria is full of trees, big trees. Aren't a lot of trees in Iraq, in Mesopotamia. In Syria, they have the Lebanon, the anti-Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. You can build big things with that, with all that stuff. But also they have mountains in that area that have minerals that are precious if you want to build a giant army with lots of iron weapons and stuff like that. So in any event, there's a lot of stuff that the Mesopotamian folks want that is in the Levant region, a lot of material goods. So that's, Assyria is trying to conquer that area. There's a fight that we don't need to get into now that lasts basically from 745 all the way to 722, the destruction of the northern kingdom of Assyria. The Assyrians end up going and besieging Jerusalem too. They keep going south. They destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. They come down to Jerusalem, and miraculously they don't end up destroying Jerusalem. This is during the time of King Hezekiah. I won't get into that now, but just to say, in 612, the Assyrian Empire is overthrown by Babylon. Assyria and Babylon are both in Mesopotamia, close to each other, and they're kind of always fighting for dominance in this era. So Babylon rises up, overthrows Assyria, takes over their empire, and then begins to push into the area around Judah. So you can see it's kind of like this downward arrow, right? Like all the way from Tiglath-Pileser III, that's kind of the high point of Israelite and Judahite power, and it goes down. So what happens in the exile and these deportations and so on, I'm going to get to that next time when we talk about the 6th century in particular. But this so far has been a story really about this kind of 8th century context, just to give, like, to set it up, because the exile doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of this centuries-long trajectory. And if you're really going to get the flavor of of Jeremiah, you want to get the flavor of Amos too. I mean, to say Micah is another prophet, a minor prophet, a short book that comes from exactly the same time. And Micah is really mad about the same things that Amos is mad about people conspiring to steal land from their neighbors and so on, and take advantage of their neighbors. That's in chapter 2. In chapter 3, Micah says that Jerusalem has been built on blood and wrong and oppression, that there's everyone is out for money, and they don't really care about each other, especially the rulers and the chiefs of the land who abhor justice and so on. And he says that Jerusalem is going to get plowed up like a field. I say that because that actually gets quoted in Jeremiah, so we'll come back to that point later. Another 8th century prophet is Isaiah. In chapters 1 through 39 of Isaiah, Isaiah ben Amoz, Isaiah son of Amos, or Isaiah of Jerusalem is another thing to call him. He prophesies starting roughly around 735 or so, and he prophesies all the way until after 701, so he's kind of this long career. And we'll talk about Isaiah later when we actually read the second part of the book of Isaiah, which is actually directed to those in the exile. Okay, so next time it's going to be kind of the history. We're going to get more into, like, after the fall of Assyria to Babylon. We're going to focus on, like, what happens from 612 basically all the way to 539 when King Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon and begins to send the exiles home. That's a lot of history and background. Maybe this is a little too much in some ways, but hopefully that's just like a little primer on how to read ancient prophetic texts, and a little bit of the background to how to understand what they're talking about and who they're talking to. If you have questions, comments, please feel free to just leave them and or email me and things like that, and I'll try to get back to you as much as I can. I hope you all have a blessed day and week, and that things start to turn around soon. Peace.